out on foot because, as you say, they could not take to the air to really conduct that search. Paula Hancock's for us as you continue to track reaction there from the Middle East. Appreciate it. Our Ivan Watson is also tracking reaction and joins us now from Hong Kong. And again, Ivan, I'd imagine, the shock really starting to register around the world.
Sure. I mean, look, the announcement that no survivors were found at the Iranian president's crash site, that's really only been in the last hour. So it will take a little bit longer to hear more reaction and an official announcement coming out of the Iranian government as well. But I think it's very important to see the commentary that's come out from neighbors and other governments running up after the news of the crash came out, because many people know about the mortality rates when it comes to helicopter crashes. First and foremost, I want to highlight the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, because he was in fact meeting face to face with the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, on Sunday morning. They were side by side inaugurating the launch of a dam project on the border of the two countries. And after news of the crash came out, Aliyev put out a statement on X saying that after bidding a friendly farewell to the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we were profoundly troubled by news of a helicopter carrying the top delegation crash landing in Iran. He said, our prayers to Allah Almighty are with President Raisi and the delegation, and that Azerbaijan was offering to help out as well. And other offers then poured in. The Iranian ambassador to Moscow said that he had basically an emergency meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at 10 o'clock Moscow time, 10 p.m. on Sunday. That I think highlights the importance that the Russian president puts in his friendly relations with Iran, which has been supplying Russia with Shahed killer drones that have been used against Ukraine on the front lines of that war. And Russia was rushing planes and rescuers to help in the now the rescue effort that is now basically a salvage effort. Turkey, a neighbor to Iran, provided a drone that was operating in those turbulent skies that my colleague Paula Hancock was just talking about, since Iran couldn't get helicopters up in that terrible weather. We've also had messages of support and concern come in from China, for example, and Pakistan, which is interesting because in January of this year, Iran launched killer attacks, deadly attacks across the border into Pakistan, which attracted just condemnation from Pakistan between those two neighbors. It gives you a sense of how prickly the relations can be in this part of the world. We've heard that President Biden has been informed about this, but we're not hearing any official reaction from the White House yet. It will be interesting to see what Iran's sworn enemy, Israel, how it will respond to this news, because, of course, it was just last month that Iran and Israel were quite literally trading blows in a sharp escalation of the years-long shadow war between these two countries. Finally, we had a message from Hamas, long supported by Iran, expressing its concern and sympathy and solidarity with Iran at this time. So it just highlights the complicated relations and the pattern of alliances that Iran enjoys in the turbulent Middle East and further abroad.
Yeah, in terms of the reaction even from countries like Pakistan, as one of our analysts put it, it is a sense of decency among Muslim countries that they will continue to express those kinds of condolences. Ivan, stay with me for a minute as we have our first look here at some new pictures just coming into CNN at the site. As you can see there, obviously daybreak, it is morning there, and you can see this is the site of the crash. It looks like a staging area right now where they've been able to get, as you can see, even ambulances there and other vehicles to try and do their first investigation of the site and obviously try and recover the bodies. Those are our first pictures. In fact, those are live pictures there from Tabriz, Iran, which is still quite a distance away from where this crash occurred. But they are setting up that staging area to begin those recovery operations. I mean, Ivan, you made such good points points there in terms of the reaction. I do want to ask you what will be a very complicated reaction inside of Iran, right? Because you will have certainly hardliners, those who are very religious as well, who would have backed President Raisi, and obviously the supreme leader. But again, those who felt that he was an unsparing, repressive president of Iran that is responsible for, in fact, condemning many to death.
Very polarized. We heard the Iranian government, the supreme leader of Iran, no less, Ali Khamenei, calling for prayers for Raisi and his entourage. And we saw on Iranian state media scenes of people quite literally praying for him. And now that will transition to prayers of mourning. After all, we're seeing that some of the anchors on Iranian state television are wearing black right now. And I think a sign of what's to come in Iran as we're likely to move into a period of official mourning. On the other side of the political spectrum in Iran, there are those who see Ibrahim Raisi as a villain. And we are seeing signs on social media. We are seeing videos of people whose families suffered under the crackdown, particularly over the last 2 years in Iran, quite literally celebrating. In one video, 2 women whose mother died in the crackdown dancing to a Turkish pop song called Helicopter. Okay? Further abroad, we have members of the diaspora who are opponents of the Islamic Republic of Iran, of the regime there in place since 1979, also celebrating this moment. And it underscores the internal divisions within this country where you have had, over the past 20 years, recurring uprisings and protest movements that the authorities have crushed using, at times, deadly force. Ibrahim Raisi himself was elected in 2021. It was historically, since the foundation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the lowest voter turnout in any presidential election. I believe it was in the 40th percentile. And the parliamentary elections of just a few months ago also had a low voter turnout. In decades past, Paula, I think you and I have reported on the power struggle between reformist and conservative camps in Iran. Experts will argue that the reformist side of the body politic in Iran has effectively been crushed for years now. And now, if there is any power struggle, it's within different shades of black and gray within the hardline and conservative camp. So a big part of Iranian political society is basically blocked out of politics, and that leaves factions, again, within the hardline and conservative side of society to then kind of duke it out over who might become a candidate and the winner of presidential elections, which, according to Iran's constitution, are to take place some 50 days after the death of the elected president.
Yeah, it is quite a fast timeline, especially given that this country will be in mourning for several days. Ivan Watson, thanks so much. You will continue to bring us news as we get it in terms of reaction. And stay with us, so we will have much more on our breaking news here in a moment.
Wind north at 6. At Columbus, it was partly cloudy and 72, wind east at 7. At Birmingham, it was clear and 70, wind calm. At Rome, it was clear and 69, wind calm. At Chattanooga, it was clear and 71, wind calm. At Asheville, with fog, it was 62, wind calm. At Augusta, it was partly cloudy and 63, wind calm. At St. Simon's Island, it was cloudy and 72, wind northwest at 8. Here is the official forecast from your National Weather Service for the Atlanta listening area. Tonight, mostly clear this evening, then becoming partly cloudy. A slight chance of showers early. Lows around 60. Light east winds. Monday, sunny. Highs in the lower 80s. East winds 5 to 10 miles an hour. Monday night, clear. lows in the lower 60s. Light east winds in the evening, becoming light and variable. Tuesday, sunny. Highs in the mid-80s. Southeast winds 5 to 10 miles an hour. Tuesday night, clear. Lows in the lower 60s. Light south winds. And now the extended forecast. Wednesday and Wednesday night, partly cloudy. Highs in the upper 80s. Lows in the mid-60s. Thursday and Thursday night, mostly cloudy. A slight chance of showers and thunderstorms. Highs in the upper 80s. Lows in the mid-60s. Friday and Friday night, mostly cloudy. A chance of showers and thunderstorms. Highs in the mid-80s. Lows in the mid-60s. Saturday through Sunday night, partly cloudy with a chance of showers and thunderstorms. Highs in the mid-80s. Lows in the mid-60s. For more detailed weather, water, and climate information, please visit our website at weather.gov/Atlanta. Here is the hazardous weather outlook. This hazardous weather outlook is for portions of north and central Georgia. For tonight, isolated to scattered showers remain possible through sunset for north and east central Georgia. Conditions clear overnight. And now the extended outlook for the period Monday through Saturday. After a period of dry weather, a chance of thunderstorms will return Wednesday through Saturday. Spotter information statement. Spotter activation will not be needed through tonight. The current time is 12:21 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Here are the midnight weather observations from around the area. At Atlanta, it was partly cloudy. The temperature was 70 degrees, dew point 63 degrees, relative humidity 78%, wind southeast at 5 miles an hour, pressure was 30.00 inches and rising. Around Atlanta, at Chamblee, it was partly cloudy and 68, wind calm.
We're going to get back to our breaking news story this hour. Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi, is believed to be dead after no survivors were found at the crash site of the helicopter carrying him. That's according to Iranian state media. The aircraft came down early Sunday afternoon as it was flying over Iran's East Azerbaijan province. It was carrying Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and 8 other people, including the country's foreign minister. The Iranian constitution states that in the case of the president's death, the first vice president shall assume his powers with the approval of the supreme leader. And in fact, we have already heard from the supreme leader. This was before we knew that the helicopter had crashed, and at the time he was promising that there would be no disruption. What you're looking at now are live pictures of the staging area not far from the crash site in Tabriz, Iran, where they are trying to obviously mount a recovery operation now, and no doubt a very extensive investigation to determine how this happened. I'm joined now by CNN military analyst and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. And I'm going to get to the military chain of command here and how we feel that happened, but I want to deal strictly now with the aviation. When you see what we've seen in terms of the crash site now, we do have a still photo of that, the terrain, the weather conditions, what could have been at play here?
Well, many factors, Paula, and I think one of the key things is, of course, the weather, as you mentioned. That would be one aspect of this. So you have fog, you have rain, you have cold temperatures, and you have the terrain that you're dealing with here. So with temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, you find that there is the possibility at higher altitudes of icing of the rotor blades. There's the possibility of even potentially engine failure. So there are a lot of different things that could, in fact, have been part of this. Plus, the other factor in this would be maintenance. Whether or not the helicopter was properly maintained. You would think, as a part of a presidential fleet, that a helicopter would receive the highest attention when it comes to the maintenance protocols associated with it. But even with some of the best oversight, there are sometimes things that happen. And of course, if there are no spare parts for the helicopter, then you get into a situation where there's a real possibility that they were using workarounds for missing parts, or they were trying to fabricate missing parts that they couldn't obtain on the international market. So those are the kinds of things that could potentially have contributed to a failure in the engine, or a failure for the aircraft itself. Then you have the factor of the terrain. This terrain is very forbidding terrain. Ivan Watson was talking about this earlier when he was mentioning that he had been through this area. It is a cavernous place at altitudes on average of about 6,000 feet. 2,400 or so meters. So that is, a pretty high average altitude to deal with. And then you have to have the understanding of what the terrain actually is. So if you're flying over something like this, you have to actually understand what the contours of the Earth actually are. And sometimes navigation aids aren't as good as they need to be. Sometimes they fail, and if that is the case, then that could also have contributed to this crash. So there are a lot of different aspects of this, Paula, but I think the key things are maintenance issues, the weather, and the fact that Iran has been living under sanctions, and they're using very old equipment even to transport their highest level leaders.
And then we get to the military chain of command. And I know you told us earlier that whether or not to fly would have ultimately rest with the pilot in this situation to kind of assess the weather conditions and if it was safe. But it seems odd to me, you had mentioned the airframe on this thing could be nearly a half century old. You had the foreign minister and the president in the same helicopter, even though there were apparently 3 that were traveling together. As someone who's obviously used to this military chain of command, we know that there was a security official on board as well. Does this strike you as odd?
I think there's always the possibility of rank intimidating people who are supposed to actually be the ones that are in charge. So there is certainly the possibility that the rank of the president, or an overbearing security official, or a protocol official that said you must get the president here at a certain time, may have contributed to this. So in many ways the pilot may have felt against his better judgment to take the mission on and move the president forward, because that's what was wanted and that's what was demanded of him. So there's definitely a possibility, and in a military hierarchy, and it's certainly true in a society like Iran's, there's a lot of obedience given to that hierarchy. So the pilot may be in charge nominally, and in the U.S., that advice of the pilot would have certainly been a key factor in a decision to go or not to go. But there's always a chance that rank could have had a factor in this, and it could have potentially overwhelmed good judgment and made it a situation where, against his better judgment, the pilot decided to fly anyways. So that's a possibility. And Paula Hancock's pointed out something that is actually quite true. The weather at the point of origin may have been okay. It's been quite good. And with changing weather, which is a very common occurrence in mountainous regions like this, the original assessment may have actually been faulty. So it may have been perfectly fine to take off from the area on the Azerbaijan border, but it may not have been fine, especially if you're flying at low altitudes, to continue the mission. And by the time that you're in the middle of something like that, it may be too late to get out of it.
It is true, because the weather at that hour was getting progressively worse as well, from what we know. Colonel Cedric Leighton for us, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And we'll be right back with more on our breaking news story in a moment.
on the relations of Iran and the United States. And so, therefore, I do think that there is going to be a void right now in the Iranian foreign ministry as far as Iranian foreign policy is concerned, as, of course, right now they will be looking to see what the future holds. As far as I know, once all the ceremonies have taken place, the burials and all of that, they will have to call for presidential elections in about 50 days. So that certainly is going to be a key time for the Islamic Republic of Iran to see where it goes next politically, presumably where it has been going over the past 3-4 years, but certainly who is going to lead all of that and who's going to be part of that government. And especially as far as foreign policy is concerned, it's going to be very, very interesting to follow to see where they go next, Paula.
Yeah, and you mentioned such a good point. We have been talking about the president, but as you said, the foreign minister, there was quite a lot of nuance to the way he conducted foreign policy for Iran. In fact, Axios reported that last week, the U.S. and Iran, in separate rooms with Oman as a mediator, were talking about how to try and de-escalate things in the region. So I want to get your take on if you think anything will change, given that there is a power vacuum there as well. These are crucial times, obviously, throughout the entire region. And pivotal, perhaps even at this hour, is what Israel's reaction will be to all of this.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that calling the way that he led his office and he conducted his affairs nuanced, I think, is very important. I think that Hossein Amir Abdollahian was a much more of a hardliner and within the spheres of the hardliners in Iran than, for instance, Jawad Zarif was. Jawad Zarif was also quite close to the supreme leader. But as far as the apparatus of the Revolutionary Guard, the military forces, and also a lot of the hardline clergy is concerned, I would say that Hossein Amir Abdollahian was definitely much more ingrained into all of that. And if you look at some of the foreign policies that he conducted, and this was quite interesting to see when Ebrahim Raisi was elected president, we had actually spoken to Hossein Amir Abdollahian just shortly before that, and all the things he had told us became the foreign policies of Iran. So there is a very hard line towards, obviously, the United States. But at the same time, of course, they did have those efforts to try and revive the Iran nuclear agreement, which so far have not really borne any fruit and are sort of on standstill right now. But they certainly did attempt to do that. But then also, especially in that time when you look at after that flare-up now with the Israelis, where it really seemed as though for a while Israel and Iran were on the brink of a much more wider, possibly for the region, catastrophic war. He was quite instrumental in trying to calm all of that down. He traveled the region. He informed, for instance, a lot of Iran's, not just allies, but a lot of countries in the region of Iran's response to the bombing of that embassy compound. And so certainly he is someone who definitely took the foreign ministry by the reins. And it's going to be interesting to see what they do next as far as foreign policy is concerned, because on the one hand, of course, there is the direction of the foreign ministry, but at the same time, of course, it also takes someone very strong in charge of the foreign ministry to form those policies, to travel the region, and of course also to have that clout among other regional leaders as well, Paula.
Yeah, certainly from what you're describing, he certainly had a lot of latitude in foreign policy and wielded that power as he could with the regime. Fred, I want to ask you before you go, I don't think a Friday went by in Iran that you didn't go to Friday prayers. President Raisi was really closely tied to certainly the religious life in Iran, and the fact that the supreme leader is the supreme leader endowed, obviously, by in this Muslim country and those devout Iranians that follow him. What do you think the reaction will be in those religious devotees?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that among the religious devotees and the sort of religious conservatives that we all saw very often, of course, at Friday prayers in Tehran, but I actually also managed to go to Friday prayers in Mashhad when Ebrahim Raisi was on hand. This was shortly after his election. That certainly is his center of power. That's where he's from. He's affiliated with a sort of religious society in Mashhad in eastern Iran, which of course is extremely powerful in Iran as well. So there's certainly, and you saw yesterday also that once the helicopter went missing, that people there were calling for folks to come out and pray. So I definitely think that it would be obviously a huge shock and blow to them. At the same time, we can already see, and this is obviously something that always happen when high-profile officials or militaries get killed or die in Iran, that he's already being called a martyr. So the whole concept of the martyrdom will certainly endear him to a lot of the very conservative religious people, very pious religious people who have been his backers, really. That really has been the backbone of the support for Ibrahim Raisi, which I think some of the guests were saying. Of course, right now, the Islamic Republic of Iran is going through some divisions, going through some difficult political times. But that was definitely the sort of bedrock of support, not just for the religious conservatives, but for Ibrahim Raisi as well. And of course, there was talk of him being in the running of possibly becoming the next supreme leader, even though it was really unclear where that stood at the current time. But yeah, I mean, it definitely will be a shock to them. At the same time, of course, there is always a succession that goes on, and I think they will be prepared for this. They will find a new president, and certainly most probably someone who, as far as the convictions are concerned, will probably be fairly close to Ibrahim Raisi, who himself was more devoted to domestic policy issues, I would say, than foreign policy. You didn't really see him that much on the foreign policy beat. He recently visited Vladimir Putin. He obviously, on the day that he was killed in that helicopter crash, met with the president of Azerbaijan. But aside from that, the foreign policy really was up to Hossein Amir Abdollahian. But as far as domestic policy is concerned, of course, he was very much a big figure. But I would also agree that he, in the time that he was in office, didn't really have time for any sort of reforms, nor was he inclined to those reforms. So I do think that fairly quickly they will be able to find a new president and hold new elections follow.
Fred Pleitgen for us. I really thank you for jumping on the phone with us, and we will continue to listen to your reporting in the coming hours. So Fred Pleitgen for us. Appreciate it. And stay with us. We'll be right back with more of our breaking news coverage. I'm Paula Newton. Our breaking news out of Iran. Iranian news agencies have confirmed the death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and the country's foreign minister. Their helicopter, carrying 9 people in total, went down on Sunday in Iran's East Azerbaijan province after the president and other officials attended a ceremony for the opening of a new dam near the border with Azerbaijan. Now, rescuers had faced difficult weather conditions overnight, including cold weather, heavy fog, as they scrambled to locate Kevin, good to have you with us. You have been following the president, who's now traveling in Michigan. I mean, look, we discussed earlier that any kind of reaction from the Biden administration would be delicate, but so too will be Israel's reaction and any influence the United States may have on that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why the White House and why the Biden administration writ large have been so careful today about what they're saying and what they're not saying as details emerge from the ground. And certainly everything that President Biden and his team say going forward will be parsed not only in Iran, but certainly around the world as they look for signs of how the U.S.-Iran relationship contention will go forward now that this has happened. And I think when you talk to officials inside the White House, there is not a great hope that this will change anything, certainly in the upper echelons of the regime in Tehran. They don't expect sort of a softening of the hardline positions that we've seen adopted over the last several years. But I think what they're looking for mostly is to contain any of the volatility that could be contained in what's going on now. And certainly when it comes to Israel, President Biden's overarching goal amid this crisis has been to prevent this conflict from spreading into a wider regional war and to prevent the United States from being dragged closer into conflict with Iran. And you saw that just in the last several months in this tit for tat back and forth between Israel and Iran. You saw the United States come to Israel's defense. You saw Iran fire drones and missiles towards Israel for the first time. That had been a point of real fear inside the White House, that could sort of spiral out of control. And they do feel like they were able to successfully contain that. And part of that is because there have been these quiet, indirect back channel conversations between Washington and Tehran, sort of sending the message that they do not want this conflict to escalate any further. Now that there is sort of a vacuum at the very top of the Iranian regime, what the White House will want to do is try and ascertain very, very quickly what Raisi's replacement's intentions are. And certainly the supreme leader sort of has the ultimate say, and the U.S. sort of feels like they know where he stands. But when you talk about those underneath him, and the foreign minister in particular, they will want to get a better read of how those new people in those positions will adopt their positions going forward. And I think that's going to be an important thing for President Biden to do now, particularly at a very fragile moment in the Gaza war, as the U.S. tries to secure the ceasefire and hostage deal, as the U.S. tries to broker this broader regional agreement with Saudi Arabia, the goal of which had been trying to provide a greater bulwark against Iran. All of that is sort of the context and the backdrop with which the president, I think, is sort of digesting this news now.
And yet, in their efforts in the last few weeks to try and de-escalate the situation and work through those back channels, even most recently as last week, is that opportunity now perhaps lost? I mean, obviously in Iran for at least a couple months, if not longer, they are going to be scrambling really to reestablish political power there. At what point is there just not going to be that latitude, which could also, in fact, impact those militias and those proxies that are backed by Iran?
Yeah, I think probably the hope is that it's not entirely lost, that it could be delayed somewhat. And I think that that is probably the goal of the Biden administration now, is to try and keep whatever relations and whatever back channels they had with the Iranian government on the same track that they were on before. But at the end of the day, some of these back channels are pretty flimsy. The U.S. doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran. They don't have the direct conversations for example, over Iran's nuclear program that had once sort of been a hallmark of the relationship. And so I think the goal now is to try and keep things stable, to try and prevent the volatility from creating a situation where President Biden can't sort of control the region. And when it comes to the proxies, that had been something that President Biden has been trying to do for months and months and months, is to try and contain the fallout from those proxy groups, including the Houthis in Yemen and also groups in Iraq and Lebanon, who have taken shots at American troops in the region. The U.S. has retaliated against those proxies. But again, the overarching mission that President Biden has had is to prevent this from becoming a direct U.S.-Iran conflict. That's something he very much is seeking to avoid.
And they will continue, obviously, on those efforts. Kevin Liptak for us, thanks so much for jumping on. Really appreciate it. I'm Paula Newton, and we'll be back with more of our breaking news coverage right after a quick break.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello and welcome to our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. I'm Paula Newton and we are following breaking news out of Iran, where state media has now confirmed the death of President Ibrahim Raisi and the country's foreign minister after a deadly helicopter crash. Now, rescue crews are now at a staging area. Those are live pictures where they are trying to assess where exactly the wreckage is and to begin their recovery efforts. Iranian officials say the helicopter ran into trouble amid heavy fog on Sunday afternoon. Images of the crash site in Iran's East Azerbaijan province show the remote mountainous area where the aircraft went down. And you are looking at a photo of it right there. The president and other officials had been attending a ceremony for the opening of a new dam near the border with Azerbaijan. Rescuers faced difficult weather conditions overnight, including cold and heavy fog, as they scrambled to locate the crash site. Iranians were urged to pray for the president amid news of the crash, with the country's supreme leader vowing that there will be no disruption in Iran's work. CNN's Paula Hancock is following all of these developments and joins us now live from Abu Dhabi. We should say state media has officially declared that their president has died, and we have not heard again from the supreme leader. But just if you can bring us right up to date on what happened and any reaction that you have coming in.
Well, Paula, we now do know that 9 people on board that helicopter lost their lives in the eastern Azerbaijan province. We know that the president was on board, the foreign minister. We understand a governor of that province, also an imam of Friday prayers of that province, along with security, the pilots, the crew. So 9 people in all went down with that helicopter. Now, you have mentioned the dire weather conditions. It took rescue teams around 16 hours to be able to locate and get to that area itself. The rescue teams were unable to put a helicopter into the air, they said, because of the weather conditions. The fact that the fog was so thick, visibility was very limited. We also heard from the rescue teams that there were sub-zero temperatures, that it was extremely cold in these areas. You can see from the images a very mountainous area, inhospitable terrain, and sparsely populated. So that's the latest information we have. We do know also from state media that the government has convened an urgent meeting. They say that, according to a photo that was provided by state media, that the chair that President Raisi would usually sit in had a black sash across it for mourning. We understand from state media as well that there will be details in the hours to come about the mourning procession, the process, the timing, the details. All those will come to us shortly through state media. But people in Iran will be waking up this Monday morning to this shocking news that both the president and also the top diplomat have lost their lives in this helicopter crash. Of course, questions will be asked internally now about what happened, about whether why this helicopter was in the air with such dire weather conditions. We know it was in a convoy. There were 3 helicopters in all carrying the delegation of President Raisi from this inauguration of the dam project just on the border with Azerbaijan. There were 3 helicopters. 2 of them landed safely, but the one carrying the president and the foreign minister, we know now, did not. Paula.
Paula Hancock's for us in Abu Dhabi, continuing to track reaction. Really appreciate it. I want to bring in CNN's chief international anchor now, Christiane Amanpour. Christiane, really good to have your insights here. You interviewed the foreign minister a little bit over a year ago. You tried to interview the president. I just want to get your reaction to what really has been shocking news.
Well, Paula, it is obviously shocking news, and it couldn't come at a more unstable time for Iran and for the region. Iran faces, as you know, those internal protests and discontent that have been crushed brutally in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's death, and that was under the direction of President Raisi and the Supreme Leader and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. It also comes at a time when this Israel war on Gaza against Hamas continues. And as you know, the perennial shadow war between Israel and Iran that had been going on broke into the open over the last several weeks. That somewhat subsided after a reaction from both sides, but nonetheless, it shows the peril of the situation. You can imagine for the United States, for the West, one of the most important issues is the Iran nuclear issue. That had been somewhat contained after the 2015 nuclear agreement that President Obama negotiated with Iran and with Europe and was rubber-stamped, or rather stamped into officialdom by the entire United Nations process. President Trump, at the urging also of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, pulled the United States out of that, and that caused much more uncertainty and stability over the process of the Iran nuclear program. We understand over the last week or so there was some word from the IAEA, the UN nuclear agency, that they were back in talks with Iran to make sure that everything was happening above board and within the nuclear regulations, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We wait to see what kind of work they were doing on that. And it's known that the United States is trying to stabilize issues with Iran, given the volatility of the region right now. As for inside Iran, as you mentioned, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei issued many statements before the news that he had actually been found dead, saying that the nation was praying, and you're bound to see days, if not weeks, of official mourning organized all over the country. He also said that the affairs of the country will not be disrupted or disturbed. To that point, there is a act of succession. There is a line of succession. There's a first vice president, and you're bound to see at least interim measures being put in place to ensure the continuous running of the system. At one point, before the Mahsa Amini death and before the protests and the riots back in 2022, Raisi, a very hardline fundamentalist, was being considered a successor to the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who himself is elderly. News of his ill health and sort of frailty have appeared to be vastly overstated over the years. However, he is aging, and there needs to be a succession there in place if that system is to continue. Raisi was then considered to have somewhat disqualified himself or besmirched and sullied his reputation, given the political and popular uprisings against him inside Iran, as well as the economy being really bad for the people. He is not considered to have brought prosperity at all to the Iranian nation. And if you look online on social media, you can see the reaction from many, many people, both outside and inside Iran. His most recent legacy will have been the brutal crackdown on the freedom life protesters, the women life freedom protesters. And from his very early days, he was very senior, if not head of the judiciary process, and he had been accused, or not accused, he had been overseeing some of the trials in the very early days of the revolution, and in one point signing off on one that led to the execution of thousands of anti-regime officials or activists. So his career has been incredibly checkered, but nonetheless, it's a big change and shock in a very volatile region and a very volatile place. And as for Hossein Amir Abdullahian, yes, I interviewed him, and he is somebody who's had a huge amount of interaction with the UN, with international governments, and he's known very well around the world. Paula?
Christian, do you think that will be a bit of a loss? I was discussing earlier just that he was a man who certainly was nuanced in his foreign policy, perhaps did the work that President Raisi didn't want to do or wasn't capable of doing. Do you think that at this pivotal time in the region and beyond, that is quite a loss for Iran as well?
You know, Paula, the truth of the matter is that Iran is run by the Supreme Leader and more by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Those are the people who run the country. The rest are acting at their service and their behest. They are not independent. You can have nuance, you can have style differences that can either be more abrasive or less, but the actual running of the country is from a much higher level. So I think certainly in international affairs and in national security affairs. So I believe that is likely not to change.
And Christian, given that they're going to have elections within about 50 days, I guess they've had these elections that at times give them certainly the veneer of legitimacy, if not in fact a legitimacy. Do you believe that there's a potential for problems there, given there was such low turnout in the election in which President Raisi was elected, and given, as you rightly point out, the repressive nature of the regime and the economic turmoil, especially with that very large young population in Iran?
Well, I think that is something really to look for. I think one of the most important political statements by the people in recent years, since the uprisings and the protests over the death of Mahsa Amini and the desperate desire for democracy and freedom and an economic future, I think that it was very significant. And the Iranian structure, the regime, was shocked at the very low turnout in those recent midterm parliamentary elections, or regional elections. I think the turnout was 41%, which was a historic low. And for them, no matter how managed these so-called elections are, and in the last several years, certainly under Raisi and before, there was almost no choice. I mean, before, they would play at having some kind of choice. There would be potentially somebody from the reform crowd being allowed to run. This time, not at all during the last presidential election. It was highly managed. And so when they came to these recent elections, they used that, they hoped, the regime, as a barometer of faith in the system, where they were told that the faith in the system is crumbling because the turnout was extremely low. So I think that is something to watch very, very carefully for in any future elections. And I do also think it's important to watch to see whether people decide to use this moment to again vent their anger and frustration at what they believe is incredibly bad governance, failure to deliver on their basic human needs, not to mention their human rights. So I think that it is an important moment to take stock. Certainly the international community has to be, fairly careful how they react, and we'll see how they react inside Iran.
Yeah, and when you talk about that careful reaction, it is quite delicate for the U.S. administration, but also how Israel reacts to this. Is this potentially quite destabilizing, as you've already pointed out, at quite a pivotal time in the region?
I think it is. And while Israel took that, it hasn't admitted it, but the initial action to blow up the Iranian consulate embassy in Damascus, Syria in April, which then led to the rather potentially very dangerous so-called tit for tat between Iran sending some 300 missiles and drones into Israel, followed by an Israeli strike around an area which houses one of the Iran nuclear plants. That could have escalated far beyond. But I remember at that point, in fact, it might have been Abdullahian, or it was several officials who said that this is now done, and they sort of put a full stop on that escalation and that out in the open conflict there. We don't know whether Israel might want to use this time for any other situation, thinking that it can maybe affect some change inside Iran. Is very unclear. Certainly the U.S. National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, was there last week and this weekend maybe, but the U.S. National Security Advisor was there, and he's going to Saudi Arabia.
I'm wondering what you believe will be the regional reaction here and beyond to what has been just stunning news in the last few hours.
Look, I think amid all the volatility and turmoil that we've seen in the region, this is one additional point of uncertainty that the region just didn't want to see. But the reality is that Iranian presidents have very little say on foreign policy. Even foreign minister is not more than a spokesperson for the foreign ministry. And in that sense, it is really the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards who make the final decisions, and even in the region, mostly implement Iran's regional policy. So I think overall, we will see more continuity than change.
When you say more continuity than change, though, given the fact that, as I said, they want these elections held, they have to be held in 50 days, is there not a risk there, though, of some type of destabilization, especially given the health of the supreme leader?
Look, in this region, there is always that kind of risk. But the reality is that in the next 50 days, I think the Iranians will be more internally focused because they would have to organize a high-stakes election in a very short period of time. Usually the vetting process in Iran is quite complicated, although conservatives are in control of all levers of power, but they are engaged in very serious infighting. And the rupture between the state and the society is quite serious. So the system would be most likely concerned about internal unrest during the next few weeks. And in that sense, I think it's not going to focus on the region as was the case in the past. Let's remember that just 2 weeks ago, Iran had a runoff parliamentary election in which only 8% of the capital's residents actually participated at the polls. And that just shows how unpopular the regime is at this moment in time.
Right, and teetering towards being illegitimate given the kind of process that's in front of people, and only 8%, as you said, showed up for that election, given that there is a risk, right, of what could happen after 50 days in this election. You mentioned that, in fact, they would be internally focused now. Where do you think that leaves Iranian militias, proxies, and how they will handle the next uncertainty in the coming weeks, in the couple months?
So look, we've seen a period of relative calm in Iraq and Syria in terms of attacks on U.S. forces in the past few months. I think that is likely to continue. We saw the very dangerous tit-for-tat between Iran and Israel that thankfully did not end in an all-out war because neither Iran nor Israel really had an appetite for an all-out war. And of course, the United States tried its best to prevent expansion of the conflict in Gaza. And all of those fundamentals, I think, will still be in place in the next 50 days. However, there are uncertainties as well. For instance, Iranian allies like the Houthis in Yemen, who are not really an Iranian proxy and have a long track record of ignoring Iranian advice, can take unilateral action without coordinating with Tehran, that if it results in significant number of casualties, it might actually escalate tensions significantly. Same applies to the fact that Iran and Israel have been in the process of rewriting the rules of the game. So the old rules are out, but the new rules are not yet established. And in that space, there is a possibility of miscalculation. And finally, there are tensions between Israel and Iran's closest ally in the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon, that could, again, at any moment flare up and spiral out of control. So the risks are quite significant.
I want to ask you about what you believe the reaction will be inside Iran. I don't think anyone believes that there will be an uprising, but what do you think is the danger there for the supreme leader, as obviously he tries to convince people that, in his words, there will be no disruption?
Look, this is a system that